Hello everyone. Let's make sure audio is working. Somebody let me know if you can hear me, that would be fantastic. And we'll just open up that. Cool. Okay, so as you can see, we are reviewing, I don't know if you can actually see it, Perspective Philosophy's video, now a year old, on morality is objective even if there is no God. As we'll see curiously, this actually plays, this no God part plays very little role in the actual video. And of course the video is a year old, actually a little bit over a year old now. But there we go. I know it's going to happen. It's like a tradition at this point. So why am I responding to it if it's so old? He's obviously gone into his PhD since this came out, for those of you who are familiar with this guy. Well, it's because he still recommends it. And I find this video personally very frustrating. This stream is sort of precipitating an actual long-form response to it, which is shaping up to be extremely long. But it's actually been some time since I've actually gone through the whole thing and just kind of listened to it and thought about it in real time. So that's what this is going to be. And then at some point in the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a longer form breakdown of the video, some problems with it. We're going to try to approach it. The thing about this guy is that he's not actually a hack. I think what he is amateurish. So I don't doubt for a second that Lewis, who is Perspective Philosophy, I don't doubt for a second that he's trying to be sincere, but he makes some really, really bad gaffes, and then is extremely overbearing to other people, especially on lefty YouTube, on the basis of some really faulty reasoning. And the thing is, like, if you're going to throw your weight around and tell people that you come to the conclusions that you have because your degrees in sociology, as he did to Vosh, or if he talks about at one point in one stream a political science degree being awful, which, I mean, to be totally honest, 9 times out of 10 that's probably true, but you'd better be really good. So in any case, we're just going to go through this. Hopefully it doesn't take an exorbitant amount of time. I apologize again for being late. The pollen has been absolutely destroying my throat this week, so I absolutely needed to get like fluids and whatnot so I don't start choking and dying midstream. But without further ado, it seems like the audio's fine. People can hear me, so let's just get right into it. Morality is objective even if there is no God.
Through centuries of scourges and disasters brought about by your code of morality, you have cried that your code had been broken, that scourges
Is this audible? Can you guys hear this?
were punishment for breaking it, that men were too weak and too selfish to spill all the blood it required. You damned man, you damned existence, you damned this earth, but you never dared to question your code. You went on crying that your code was noble, but human nature was not good enough to practice it. And no one rose to ask the question, good, by what standard?
So you can hear. Okay, good. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that this was actually fully audible. Can we all hear this? I'm just going to rewind a little bit. I just want a confirmation before we go in because it's like 30 minutes long, so I'd rather not
human nature was not good
spend an
enough
hour
to practice
replying
it.
to this if it's not.
And no
you can't
one
hear it.
rose to ask the question, good, by what standard?
Hello? Anybody there? Let me know if you can hear this. Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry, for some reason the chat wasn't updating on my end. That is strange. All right, well, let's keep going then.
So that quote was by Ayn Rand's John Galt in Atlas Shrugged. At first glance, it seems as though it's an attack on objective ethics, but in fact, it's in support of it.
Okay, so this is kind of a strange way to start, obviously, and this is kind of borne out. This sort of bears out that this was made before his acceptance into a philosophy PhD. That being said, it's a little bit strange. Ayn Rand is not particularly respected amongst philosophers generally because she's just a very, very bad reader of specifically the philosophers that she criticizes or that she uses. So she fundamentally misunderstands Aristotle and absolutely butchers Kant. And we'll see, actually, as this goes on, that there's some butchery of Kant going on here. But again, like, this is... It's really strange that he still recommends this. This is actually something that would probably hurt you a little bit career-wise going forward. But yeah. It's just a strange way to start this off with an Ayn Rand quote.
In today's episode, we will be discussing objective ethics and how to justify it. For those of you who are new to ethics, let me tell you what's at stake. The proposition whether murder is good or bad, if subjective ethics is true, are just as justified.
Okay, pay attention to this. He's talking about subjective ethics. The title of the video is morality objective? Sorry, is that morality is objective?
Rape, torture, murder, genocide, all of these atrocities can be justified if the person who makes the judgment deems it to be justified or not. This is because subjectivism is based upon the mental states of the agent, psychological dispositions in which one agent creates the rules for whether something is right or wrong. So if this is the case, we can say that the people who committed the 9/11 terror attacks were not immoral. On the other hand, if objective ethics is true, which I will be arguing throughout this piece, they were immoral. There is a standard beyond the individual which dictates right and wrong behaviour. And in case anyone's wondering, none of this entails a god. You can be as secular as you like, anti-theist, atheist, and there is no question of whether you need a god or not.
Hallelujah. Okay, so right off the bat, he is setting up sort of a false dichotomy between subjectivist or subjective ethics and objective ethics. And you don't actually need a division that strong. So for example, you may not believe that there is an objective ethics, that is to say, an ethics or a morality, and we'll have to clarify these terms a bit more as this goes on. He's sort of waffling, so it's confusing me even. But you can say that there is no such thing as an objective ethic, and yet you can have an ethic that is not actually specified entirely by the brain states of individual actors. So, for example, you could have a morality or an ethics that is culturally relative. So you could have sort of cultural spheres in which certain norms of morality and ethics apply, and actually apply in a very strong sense, not in the sense of like, well, they're all just sort of diluted, but in the sense that like, no, there actually is like a rational system in place that we can appropriately call morality. That's arguable. I'm not saying that's necessarily how I would sort of break this down, but to divide this between sort of absolute objectivity and sort of like a super subjectivity with respect to morality is, I think, a bit reductive, and it sort of misses some of the nuance that often goes into ethical theory. But anyways.
So the first thing I'd like to point out is that there is a difference between saying that ethical statements can be true and that ethical statements are indeed true. So it is the case that if objective ethics is true, that some statements will obtain truth value in theory. However, just because they can obtain truth value doesn't mean they will obtain truth value. Murder is wrong might not actually be correct. There needs to be an argument in favour of the proposition in the form of rational evidence proof. So this holds
Okay. I'm not entirely sure. I'm going to let him keep talking, but that's a very strange statement. Murder is wrong is, what is it? What's the Kantian term? It's not a maxim. Is it a maxim? Yeah, anyways. Murder is wrong is something that you arrive at a priori. It's not something you would necessarily apply evidence to. You would have to have a rational justification. The word evidence is kind of strange in this context.
particular significance because people like to point out, you know, can I come to some sort of absolute moral statement, like absolute moral truth?
Warm pretzels. Or, no, wait. It's the smell of absolute moral truth?
Absolutely not. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life in every single way imaginable. And this is not surprising because philosophy is not a complete subject. And there are very few subjects indeed that have resolved all the minutiae of dilemma that encompasses the subject.
Okay, so this is going to be the last frivolous pause I make before we let him talk at length. One of the... Oh, this is a great frame to pause on. One of the weird things about this video is that, and one of the things that makes it extremely difficult to follow along and break down into like its composite parts, you can understand what the argument actually is that if you pay attention, no one sentence for most of the video actually leads logically into the next. So, it's like, so if we rewind a little bit.
Philosophy is not a complete...
Pretzels. Or, no, wait.
...of the proposition in the form of rational evidence.
Just pay attention to this.
So this holds particular significance because people like to point out, you know, can I come to some sort of absolute moral statement, like absolute moral truth?
Okay, so can I come to some absolute moral statement?
Warm pretzels. Or, no, wait. It's the smell of absolute moral truth?
Absolutely not. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life.
Okay. Can I come to absolutely true moral statements? Absolutely not. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. That is not an answer to the previous thing he said. And then if we keep on going...
Every single way imaginable. And this is not surprising because philosophy is not a complete subject.
And now we shouldn't be surprised that he's not going to tell us how to live our life in every way possible in answer to the question, can we arrive at absolutely true moral statements? Because philosophy is not a complete subject. It's very bizarre. This is going to happen sort of repeatedly, and I'm not trying to pick on this to be mean. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. This really makes me wonder how much of this is... Because he's reading off of a script, right? There are no stumbles. I'm like filling in gaps in my speech with ahs and ums and things like that. He's not. I wonder how much of this is actually put together from like different scripts that he had lying around from like previous streams. So I'm a little bit hesitant to like judge him too harshly for this one because it seems more... well, I mean, maybe it should be judged harshly either way, but it seems to be more a product of laziness than like an actual internal muddledness. Because I've seen him on other streams, and he seems pretty lucid and like coherent. He's sometimes unintelligible, but it doesn't appear to me like he's actually lost the plot. More like he's just bad at explaining himself. So, perspective philosophy is here. Oh, speak of the devil. Wonderful. Hey, Lewis. I'm sorry. By the way, you should tell me what this music is, because it's fantastic. You're not reading off a script. Well, that's impressive. All right. Well, let's keep going then.
And there are very few subjects indeed that have resolved all the minutiae of dilemma that encompasses the subject. So please take into consideration that just because ethical statements can be true doesn't mean that they necessarily are true. So many of you might be sat here wondering what I'm going to tell you is good and bad and how we are going to judge whether something is good or bad. What I'm actually going to tell you is that you're using the word wrong. That's because the word morality has been changed over countless centuries. Moral became known as a noun ever since it was translated from the Latin moralis. It began to refer to a story or passage that teaches the moral of the story. This developed over time to refer to certain behaviors and eventually became a predicate in its own right. Individuals began referring to actions as being moral or immoral, as if they contained some characteristic or trait of good or bad.
Okay, I'm a bit iffy on the history here. So, as far as I'm aware, the first use of the major first use of moralis in the context of ethical philosophy is by Cicero, and it was used to translate ethikos or ethos. So in that context, it did actually refer to character and customs and things like that. They had a more or less identical meaning. We do talk about the moral of the story. I would like to have like a firmer grasp of the actual historical trajectory here. What I'm not seeing is the point. And the reason I'm not seeing the point is that, like, for example, so in my videos, I will often talk about how our use of words like politics has changed radically over time. But the reason I do that is because a lot of political thinkers use the term as if its meaning is obvious, and then will build off of that term and a received meaning of that term that's not made explicit or concrete or clear. And so you end up with a bunch of theory with sort of hidden premises that you might not actually agree with if you actually like apply it sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? If you apply it consciously to the thing that they think that they're applying it to. In this particular context, though, when we talk about the distinction between morality and ethics, or what morality means, in moral philosophy, these things are hyper-specified. So we know more or less exactly what the person is referring to, and what we would do is we would interrogate specifically what are the premises that don't match up with our understanding of whatever element it's implicating. So, for example, if morality implies, if let's say Kant, and I'm just pulling this out of my ass, but if Kant says something to the effect of like, morality follows from this particular disposition of this part of your mind, if we determine that his conception of sort of the parts of the mind or whatever are incoherent or inconsistent with what we have by consensus decided is a proper understanding of the mind, then we can say that his conception of morality is flawed. But accepting his premises, we can sort of work fruitfully and productively from his definition. And it's I'm not entirely certain what work this is supposed to do, especially since he's already been equivocating between morality and ethics up till now. So, Perspective Philosophy says, let me know when you are done. I'll come on for a Q&A if you like. I'll think about that. We'll see if I manage to survive to the end of this. I'd be happy to have you on another day, for sure. But again, like, I'm dying from pollen here, so.
You are right, Miss Bennett. Perhaps I am too hard. It is only in defense of my rank that I feel bound to abstain. A gentleman does not conger.
This broke morality away from a standard from which it could be judged in the first place. People still do this today. For example, people discuss lying as being immoral or moral.
I can't lie!
Commendable, Mr. Reed.
Depending upon the circumstance. Of course, we now have to qualify the action as being justified or unjustified, rather than it actually being judged against a standard in the first place. People refer to their values, their notions of good, what I think is right and wrong.
Okay, but that isn't... This isn't to imply that there is no standard, though, right? This is to imply that in their judgment something meets or doesn't meet a standard.
This is because it is an object for the individual to hold. A good example of this is actually Kant's categorical imperative, in which the goodness of an action could be judged against three maxims. The first maxim is whether the proposition can be universalized. The proposition, it is good to kill people, we'd have to see whether it would make sense for us to kill people and for everyone to kill people.
Well, obviously the dilemma is clear. How do you kill all 6 people? So I would dangle a sharp blade out the window to slice the neck of the guy on the other track as we smush our 5 main guys.
This means that if everyone was to kill people, there would be no one left to murder, therefore murder is irrational because it cannot be universalized. The second maxim is whether it relates to the end of a rational agent, and this pertains to the happiness or the goodness of a single individual.
10 more, buddy.
People good. People good. Why is that so hard to remember? People... what is it?
Good?
Good.
Whether you respect the value of another human being. However, Kant never actually gives a justification, or at least a good one, for respecting others, and pretty much anything can pass universalization.
I don't think that's true. In fact, he just No, not everything can pass not everything, pardon me, can pass universalization. See, I had something on this prepared. Right. So not everything can pass universalization. Let's see, we'll let him read this quote and then we'll respond to this. I'm iffy on how much I want to spend dealing with Kant here, because I don't think Kant is actually given...
And pretty much anything can pass universalization. So we have an almost empty...
Oh, so he just has the quote here. Okay. So it's self-evident to be the matter of every good will, since the idea of a will that is absolutely good without a limiting condition, that we take this end, every end to be effective, to be thoroughly abstracted from, as it would make every vulnerable act good. Right. Okay, so this quote doesn't really help us here. So basically, what Kant is getting at in the groundwork, which is distinct from the metaphysics of morals, which is where he's actually going to start doing, he's going to start applying sort of the pure reason of the groundwork to practical issues, is that he is trying to identify what in a decision or an action is the good in that action specifically. So, for example, do not murder is universalizable. You can say that do not murder is universalizable. And what that means is that you can have everybody hold that as a stance and it doesn't contradict itself. So for instance, if everybody can lie with respect to their promises, this is the example that he gives. If everybody can give a promise in bad faith, it would destroy the capacity of people to make promises, and it would be sort of self-destructive in that way. By contrast, everybody can not murder. That is a thing that everybody is able to do. And it is for the absolute good of everybody all at once, so it's not simply for the good of a single will. So this doesn't mean that... Yeah, so not everything can pass universalization. There are lots of things that can't. That's why it's a meaningful thing to distinguish. I think what he's running with here, though, is Hegel's critique of Kant. And I'm not a Hegel or a Kant expert, but I'm coming to the opinion that Hegel probably didn't give Kant his... I don't want to say his due diligence, but he probably didn't give Kant enough credit. But yeah, we'll just keep on going.
So we have an almost empty formulation. This is so empty, in fact, Kant even goes so far in saying there is nothing it is possible to think of anywhere in the world, or indeed anything at all outside it, that can be held to be good without limitation, except only a good will.
Yeah, because this is a formal distinction. So in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, again, as distinct from the critique of practical reason or from the metaphysics of morals, because Kant wrote fairly voluminously on ethics, he is talking about how do you determine what is the moral qua the moral. So it's not that nothing can be held to... Notice the wording here. This is important. Now, my translation is slightly different. This one says, nothing at all can be held to be good without limitation, excepting only a good will. My translation, which is the Broadview one, which is great because it comes with a bunch of appendices that actually, like, give you a bunch of responses to the book, reads that nothing can possibly be conceived in the world or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification, except a good will. So then he goes on, intelligence, wit, judgment, and the other talents of the mind, however they may be named, or courage, resolution, perseverance, as qualities of temperament, are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects. But these gifts of nature may also become extremely bad and mischievous if the will which is to make use of them, and which therefore constitutes what is called character, is not good. So what he's talking about is, what is the good in itself? In moral terms, like what is the good, not what is the good and also the and also has utility, for example. And in this respect, like, this actually makes a lot of sense. So ultimately, when you reduce it right down, the only thing that is good without qualification is a will that is oriented specifically, inclined specifically, to do good most of all, or simply to do good. And then, of course, that's empty because he has yet to determine what that stuff is practically. And he is very careful to distinguish between what he calls moral anthropology, which is to say, how do we inculcate morals by means of the law, or by means of culture or art, things like that. In practice, like, yeah, so just like materially, how do you get humans to actually do good things in the best way, things like that? That's what he calls moral anthropology. What he's doing here is just like the pure rational delineating of what is good in the world. And the only thing that he finds, like the root of it, is just an inclination towards the good. Sort of like a laser, a one-to-one.
So this relates to the good will being good. This means that so long as an individual believes they are doing good, and so long as it relates to an agent's ends, at least in their opinion, it is good.
No. No, that's not what that means. What it means is that so long as an agent believes they are doing good, we can ascribe their actions to a good will. But that doesn't in itself mean that the action that they're doing is itself good. They can be in error.
So, pretty much anything.
No, because again, like... again, like, if somebody is doing something that can't be universalized without creating a contradiction, without going against reason, then Kant would not hold that to be good. He might hold the person to have a good will, but Kant wasn't stupid. Like, he understood that people have, like, degrees of ignorance, they can make mistakes, and they can will the good. I mean, keeping in mind, Kant's not just, like, an excellent philosopher, he's also a Christian. Like, this is a fundamental part of his belief. Human beings can will the good and be wrong. I do the evil that I hate, right?
Can be good. Since Kant argues that we should do our duties for duty's sake, and this ultimately is what it means to do the right thing, we need to understand what our duties are. How do we come to these conclusions? What do we understand to be the right thing to do? Since everything ultimately passes, or at least most things can pass the categorical imperative, what is the good? So you can see how this will instantly lead to conflict. Not just the conflict inside of the individual in their decision-making process, but actually conflict between individuals as they fight over what they should be doing. This is said best in the words of Alistair MacIntyre. What I earlier picked out as a distinctively modern standpoint was of course that which envisages moral debate in terms of confrontation between incompatible and incommensurable moral premises, and moral commitment as the expression of a criterionless choice between such premises. A type of choice for which no rational justification can be given.
What I earlier picked out is... I don't see how this bears on the question. So, this, what this seems to be talking about is the kind of, the sort of dispersion of, what do I want to say? There isn't like a hegemonic morality in absolute terms culturally anymore. So people come to moral debates with an array of different assumptions and different underlying rationales, different concepts of the good, things like that. And it does lead to conflict, obviously. But this doesn't have a bearing on whether or not morality is objective, or if ethics is objective. Ethics is objective, by the way. This is one point that he's going to I don't think he's going to make it well, but he's going to touch on it. But I just don't see how this bears on the question. Because I mean, like, the question is directly, this doesn't bear on the question. This is what motivates the question. Is there an objective morality? Because if there was no disagreement, we probably wouldn't consider that to be a very serious question. Because it would be now a choice between, okay, good job, guys. The morality you all agree with is objective. Carry on.
And of course, no rational justification can be given, because it relies upon two rival rationalities, yours and mine.
Hang on, I want to make sure I understood him correctly here.
Can be given. And I earlier picked up incommensurable moral premises, and moral commitment as the expression of a criterionless choice between such premises, a type of choice for which no rational justification can be given. And of course, no rational justification can be given, because it relies upon two rival rationalities, yours and mine.
Okay, but that doesn't mean a rational justification can't be... Well, hang on. Okay, so maybe there is something to this point, because what this pivots on is what we describe as how we define, a justification. And if a justification has to be a justification to an opposite party, I mean, I suppose so. And I guess if you don't share the same rational foundation, then the criterion of what a justification is, I mean, it's not there. So, I mean, that's fair. But again, like, this is an epistemic problem. This has to do with how we determine what is moral. This doesn't have to do with whether or not morality is actually objective.
So many of you may be confused now, because it seems as though I've done the opposite of what I intended to do. Have I not given an argument for subjective ethics? Have I not given an argument against the ontological objectivity of a notion of good as being judged by given agents? Have I not said that it relates to the mental states of the individual who judges it and their subjective rationality?
Hang on a sec. Let's make sure that we're understanding. So I'm going to rewind a lot in this because I want to make absolutely certain that we're understanding what he's saying.
And mine. So many of you may be confused now, because it seems as though I've done the opposite of what I intended to do. Have I not given an argument for subjective ethics?
No, I don't think he has.
Have I not given an argument against the ontological objectivity of a notion of good?
No, I don't think he had. Well, of a notion of good. I mean, which notion of good? The objective, the notion of good being objective, he hasn't given an argument against.
As being judged by given agents. Have I not said that it relates to the mental states of the individual who judges it and their subjective rationality?
No, that's how you described subjective morality. I don't think you actually argued for this.
Well...
Sorry, I'm not like... These aren't takedowns. I just want to like be clear on what he's done so far and like where he's going.
I did give that argument, but it's not something I would argue for. I'm not a Kantian, and I certainly think objective ethics exists. So now I'm going to explain how the translation of morality in the first place has caused this entire dilemma.
Good.
So unlike moral, moralis and ethikos actually translate to pertaining to character. It relates to the behaviors of an individual, not an abstract notion of good. This is why Hegel...
No, it doesn't necessarily relate to an abstract notion of good. I'll just let him keep going.
Makes the move to define morality as subjective, in terms of what we've discussed, and ethics as objective. This distinction was first coined by him, and relates to a movement back towards a Greek notion of right. So,
okay, so two things. First of all, there is no Greek notion of right. The closest approximation you can get is a Greek notion called, I think it's pronounced D-I-K-E with accent somewhere in there. And that just refers to a kind of deification of the idea of there being a better or a worse way to organize a state, or a polis, more specifically. I apologize, Clifford Bates. With respect to the other thing that Hegel coined, this distinction between ethics as objective and morality as subjective, that's a little bit hairy. I think that as far as I'm aware, Hegel stacks in sort of like the way in which he presents his descriptions of morality and ethics, with morality being at a lower level of self-consciousness and ethics being at a higher one because objective, because being emerging from a relation between agents as opposed to within the subjectivity of one. But he doesn't distinguish ethics and morality simply in terms of its substance, right? So the critical addition, as again, I'm not a Hegel scholar, but the critical addition on my reading is the emphasis on self-consciousness, on different sort of levels of spirit. That's what he calls it, or of mind, on certain translations. Whereas Kant doesn't have this, but Kant absolutely does distinguish between ethics and morality, and he accords them the exact same place in terms of what they are. Ethics has to do with sort of culturally inculcated virtues and characters and things like that. And this is consistent, of course, going back to Cicero, going back to Aristotle. Whereas morality concerns actions. And the reason why this is important is because while your virtues and your character is itself the product of what Hegel would call sort of this objective realm of ethics, or of ethical life, your personal decisions, while they're sort of downstream from your character that comes from that, they are made by your subjectivity. So the level of the moral is at a lower level of self-consciousness. I don't know how far I want to take that, but that's more or less that's how I would clarify that statement. Am I making sense? It's really tricky to like comment on stuff like this because Hegel and Kant, especially Hegel, are notoriously obtuse writers. Like, I can't stress enough. Like, if it's almost impossible to tell from my vantage which of us is correct on this. The only reason why I'm pretty confident is I have the text in front of me right here. But no, I take that back. I don't think this is. Let's keep going.
Hegel argued for the prevalence of right over good. He did this because duty became so abstract.
No, that's actually wrong, and I'll quote directly here. That's actually just wrong. So this is from the Elements of the Philosophy of Right. The identity, which is accordingly concrete, of the good and the subjective will, the truth of them both is ethical life. So ethical life isn't prevalent over the good. Ethical life is the identity of the subjective will with the good in the concrete form of an actual state. So an actual culture that actualizes this identification of the good and the subjective will. So it's not just the case that you, a subjective will, choose good in the moment, but rather that the environment in which you're in actually produces you as a thing that is aligned with the good. So the crucial term here is it's the concrete identity of the good and the subjective will. So it's not just a will that wills the good, because that is pretty denuded of any sort of substance. That's a formal distinction. That's saying that, oh yeah, I'm sort of pointed in the direction of X. It's like a compass, right? Like you're in the middle of the ocean, you have a compass and it points in a certain direction. I'm oriented towards north. Well, what's north? Well, nothing. As far as you're aware, you're out to sea. That's probably a bad example. Okay, it's like you're oriented towards the good, and you will the good, but the word good has no substantive content. So you still have a good will, but that's not the end. That's not the end of the story, because we haven't actually determined what the content of good is. What Hegel is saying here is that this is a merely abstract universality. Ethical life, by contrast, is a concrete identification of the good in the subjective will. So you're not just oriented to the good, but you are good. And so this is sort of where morality and ethics meet in Hegel.
Abstract in Kantian ethics that it was unintelligible. Instead, he thought that it needed to be grounded within the individual, that we needed a reason to do our duties in the first place. This is because
No, I don't. That's not specific to Hegel. Sorry, I'm pausing a lot here. It's just, there's a lot that's really questionable. So again, like, Kant specifically has an entire half of the metaphysics of morals that is devoted specifically to ethics, because you need those drives to do the good, to choose the good. Kant is not a purely formalistic thinker. And he wrote this, I think, like, what's the actual time period here? Oh, did I not bring that book in the room with me? He wrote the Metaphysics of Morals before, I think before any of Hegel's books were published. Let me double check here. Metaphysics of Morals publication date. 1797. Phenomenology of Spirit. Publication date. 1807, yeah. Yeah, so 10 years before. Which isn't long, to be fair. But
doing one's duty for the sake of their duty requires both libertarian free will, in which the individual can do anything in which they want to do, that they can just make it so regardless of the drives which actually urge them forwards, and it also requires perfect reason, from which they can discern from an absolute abstract concept the particular action in which they should enact upon the
I'm just
world.
going to rewind this.
They can just make it for the sake. Instead, he thought that it needed to be grounded within the individual, that we needed a reason to do our duties in the first place. This is because doing one's duty for the sake of their duty requires both libertarian free will, in which the individual can do anything in which they want to do, that they can just make it so regardless of the drives which actually urge them forwards, and it also requires perfect reason, from which they can discern from an absolute abstract concept the particular action in which they should enact upon.
Okay, so maybe insofar as they need to actually will specifically the good, and they need to know. Okay, so this is an epistemic problem more than anything else, because I don't think there's actually a contradiction between willing the good and not understanding what the good is. It seems like that identification could happen by accident. I think, I can't recall, but I think Kant actually says something to that effect in the groundwork. But the primary issue here is, again, if you're trying to isolate the moral or to judge an action as moral, specifically moral, without any sort of external element coming in. So, for example, utility, or maybe you get some kind of, at like a subterranean level, or a subliminal level, you get like, subconscious, that's what I'm looking for. At a subconscious level, you get some kind of gratification or pleasure or enjoyment or relief from a certain action, even if there appears to everybody else as if there is no other motive except the good of the thing. And it becomes sort of impossible to judge in the world actual actions as truly good. But that's not the problem. That's not the question that Kant's really concerned with here. The question Kant is concerned with here is, what is the good qua the good in morality? And you can only determine what morality is, what is the moral qua the moral, by stripping away everything else. This is his argument, by stripping away everything else except the will towards the good itself. And because that's sort of inscrutable to us, you know, it's hard to judge in reality. But yeah, this isn't a distinction introduced by Hegel. This is something assumed by both Kant and Hegel.
From the world. This is why Hegel says, from my point of view, the essence of the will is duty. Now, if my knowledge stops at the fact that the good is my duty, I am still going no further than the abstract character of duty.
Okay.
I should do my duty for duty's sake, and when I do my duty, it is a true sense my own objectivity which I am bringing to realization. In doing my duty, I am by myself and free.
Yeah.
To have emphasized this meaning of duty has constituted the merit of Kant's moral philosophy and the loftiness of outlook, because every action explicitly calls for a particular content
Yeah, exactly.
and a
They
specific
agree.
end. While duty as an abstraction entails nothing of the kind, the question arises, what is my duty? As an answer, nothing is so far available except A, to do the right, and B, to strive after welfare, one's own welfare, and the welfare in universal terms, the welfare of others.
Yeah.
So
that's fine. I don't see how this defends the distinction that perspective philosophy is trying to make here. However, there's something a little bit funny about this, and it's a minor point and has no bearing whatsoever on the content of the argument. This is not Hegel. This is a note that was appended to Hegel's Elements of the Philosophy of Right by his student Hotho. So this isn't actually Hegel. However, we can forgive that because it's included. The way in which Cambridge formats their edition of the Elements of the Philosophy of Right is very confusing. I had to go back and read the introduction like 6 times to figure that out.
let's imagine a very Kantian scenario. To do one's duty is to respect others. Now I ask you, how do you respect another person? Well, Hegel would reply that this is entirely dependent on your socio-cultural position.
And crucially, so would Kant. Respecting others is the formal is like is a formal imperative. It has no actual content. But then you apply that to a practical case, and you derive what respecting others means in context. So again, like moral anthropology. The groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is just the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, and crucially, it's just the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, not for all moral questions. He does actually like deal with this in other books. So, okay, guys, be nice. Lewis is being polite. We should be polite back.
To respect another individual relies upon the normative structure of your society. Do we shake hands?
Okay, so guys, just a heads up. Obviously, I disagree with this guy's takes on a lot of things. We do not insult people in my chat, especially if they are present. So, Mystic. That is now gone. Anyone who does that in future will be banned, so just a heads up. And please remind people if you see them doing so. Thank you.
Do we bow? What gesture of respect do we give an individual, and on what occasion, is entirely culturally defined within the concepts and the way of being of your socio-cultural position, of your historical period.
Live long and prosper.
Specifically of the ethos of your community. So again, when Cicero translated ethikos as morality, or as moralis, sorry, actually, maybe perspective philosophy can help me out here. I don't speak Greek. I keep mixing up ethos and it's ethikos. It's ethikos. When he translated ethikos as morality, what that is for is actually it's curious. It almost has like it's a slightly more advanced form of what is referenced in the Odyssey when it talks about Odysseus like seeing the nomoi of different peoples. I'm probably remembering that incorrectly, but the idea is like different communities produce different kinds of people. So this is the relationship between this is the reason why ethikos is again like locally specific and why it refers to customs. It's not just referring to customs. Like ethical philosophy was the reason why Aristotle calls his ethics a book of political an epistemic politikon, political science, is specifically because he's talking about, well, what kind of citizens are we producing and how do we produce the best citizens by means of our habits, our customs, things like that. I don't know where I was going with that, but we'll keep going.
This shows that there is a conceptual basis, a conceptual grounding, which relates us as individuals. And this is vitally important. On the other hand, if we look at the Kantian notion of good, it becomes unintelligible.
No.
We begin asserting notions of goodness and badness in relation to whether we should or should not respect individuals. Should we respect them? Should we not respect them?
No, you arrive at maxims that say that you should respect individuals, and then you determine via moral anthropology, or by applying the metaphysics of morals to what's the actual... Give me a sec. I'm actually going to get the book because I want the actual quote. All right. So I have the metaphysics of morals here. There's a quote that clarifies this pretty well that I had underlined. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to just read this out. Hopefully this is the quote I wanted. But just to... Yeah, exactly. So if, therefore, a system of a priori cognition from concepts alone is called metaphysics, a practical philosophy which has not nature but freedom of choice for its object will presuppose and require a metaphysics of morals. That is, it is itself a duty to have such a metaphysics, and every human being also has it within himself, though in general only in an obscure way. For without a priori principles, how could he believe that he has a giving of universal law within himself? But just as there must be principles in a metaphysics of nature, for applying those highest universal principles of nature in general to objects of experience, a metaphysics of morals cannot dispense with principles of application, and we shall often have to take as our object the particular nature of human beings. So this is important, actually, by the way. So for the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, he's not actually talking about morality for humanity specifically. He's talking about he's talking about morality for rational beings qua rational beings. This is one of the really interesting things about Kant. He's one of the first political and moral theorists to actually talk about a conception of a rational being that isn't specifically human. But continuing with this quote here, a metaphysics of morals cannot dispense with principles of application, and we shall often have to take as our object the particular nature of human beings, which is cognized only by experience, in order to show in it what can be inferred from universal moral principles. But this will in no way detract from the purity of these principles or cast doubt on their a priori source. This is to say, in effect, that a metaphysics of morals cannot be based upon anthropology, but can still be applied to it. And then it goes on, the counterpart of a metaphysics of morals, the other member of the division of practical philosophy as a whole, would be moral anthropology, which I mentioned earlier, which, however, would deal only with the subjective conditions in human nature that hinder people or help them in fulfilling the laws of a metaphysics of morals. So it's not empty, it's not the whole story. It would be kind of like, it'd be kind of like if you read Hegel, but you just stopped at the lordship and or lord and bondsman. What is it? Lord and bondsman? Master-slave dialectic. That's the usual reading.
To do such a thing is obviously to incur the wrath of David Hume.
What?
And Hume's law.
Wait a minute.
Hume's
Hang on.
Individuals. Should we respect them? Should we not respect them? It becomes unintelligible. We begin asserting notions of goodness and badness in relation to whether we should or should not respect individuals. Should we respect them? Should we not respect them? To do such a thing is obviously to incur the wrath of David Hume.
That doesn't make
and
sense.
Hume's law. Hume's law is an argument in which says that we cannot derive an ought from an is. An example of this would be saying that humans do eat meat in the wild, or humans can eat meat, and therefore humans should eat meat. This is to take an is statement, a statement which relates to what a being is ontologically, and relate that to how we should behave. There is an inferential jump which is not being met. How is it that one statement determines the next?
Okay, but hang on. Asking moral questions in relation to whether we should respect people or not, how is that committing the naturalistic fallacy? How is that deriving an ought from an is? It's a question. That doesn't make any sense. Let me just rewind here. I want to make sure I actually understood this.
It's us as individuals. And this is vitally important.
Right, so the grammar that relates us as individuals.
Look at the Kantian notion of
Kantian
good.
notion.
It becomes unintelligible. We begin asserting notions of goodness and badness in relation to whether we should or should not respect individuals.
Okay, so that whether is doing a lot of work there. Whether we should or should not respect individuals. So we assert notions, of goodness or badness based upon an agreed upon consensus, let's say, of either a consensus of either we should respect individuals or a consensus of we should respect individuals. Okay, so a notion of goodness or badness derived from that. I don't know. This seems like a stretch. It almost seems like he's treating a question that should be relegated to the realm of the a priori, like an a priori determination, as if that's like a part of nature or something, or if that's like a part of. I mean, I just don't think this touches Kant is the main thing. So a moral maxim arrived at via pure reason doesn't commit the naturalistic fallacy just because a consensus can be made for the public determination of what is likely to be morality in the world. Did that make sense? Did I just warble that sentence? Yeah, so, right. So an a priori determination of what is good, say whether we should, or an a priori determination of our imperatives or our obligations, whether we should respect people, say, does not commit the naturalistic fallacy just because we in the world can then sort of assume an answer to that, to the question of whether or not we should respect other people, and then derive a good based on that. These are two separate things. It's subtle, but there's a difference. So I think this is wrong.
Should we respect them? Should we not respect them? To do such a thing is obviously to incur the wrath of David Hume and Hume's law. Hume's law is an argument in which says that we
or as I like to call him,
derive
Miss Piggy in a
ought
turban.
from an is. An example of this would be saying that humans do eat meat in the wild, or humans can eat meat, and therefore humans should eat meat. This is to take an is statement, a statement which relates to what a being is ontologically, and relate that to how we should behave.
Good.
There is an inferential jump which is not being met.
Yep.
How is it that one statement determines the next? It doesn't. These are two separate statements. One is an assertion on what the being is, and the second is a separate assertion of what we should do. They don't actually relate to one another deductively.
Right.
In fact, some people think that Hume's argument is so strong that we should just abandon objective morality as a whole. And Moore ran with this position and argued that good could not possibly be natural, creating the naturalistic fallacy, in which he argued that just because something is natural doesn't mean that we ought to act in any such given way. I disagree with Moore.
Okay, so again, pay attention here. Moore said that the good cannot be natural. So what he's going to argue here is not that... He's not going to actually make the argument that we can determine what is good by reference to what is natural. He's going to make the argument that the good is what is natural, and he's going to do that by asserting teleological understanding of human nature. And we'll get into what that is later, because we're going to get into the meat and bones of it soon.
I myself am a naturalist,
Okay.
and I'm going to explain how to ground the justification of an action within human nature itself. First thing
Exactly.
we must do is overcome the is-ought divide. How is it that we can make ought statements based off a natural occurrence? Am I not describing a being and then prescribing a separate action upon that? Let me...
That's weirdly phrased.
Is it that we can make ought statements based off a natural occurrence?
Okay.
Am I not describing a being and then prescribing a separate action upon that? Let me give you an example of how to overcome this. If I was to give you the example of a watch,
Okay.
what would you tell me that a watch was? A timepiece? It must have some relation to keeping the time. I could build the statement from this that a watch should tell the time in order to be a watch. Another example would be a guitarist. For someone to be a guitarist, they should be able to play the guitar. If they can't play the guitar, are they even a guitarist? The argument I am giving here is one given by Alistair McIntyre, in which he argues for the existence of functional concepts. Functional concepts are is-statements which relate to the functions of objects. A seed can only be understood by its germination and its production of a new plant.
Okay.
There is a process which...
Let's steelman this, as they say.
argues for the existence of functional concepts.
Functional concepts. Remember this term. Functional concepts.
Functional concepts are is-statements which relate to the functions of objects.
Okay, so is statements relating to the functions of objects. So the telos of an organism, say, treated as an is statement as something solid. This is, of course, how Aristotle treats it, because this is why he calls the end of a thing its first cause, right? It's both beginning and end. You understand what a seed is by reference to what it will become. Otherwise, it's just a weird little rock you found on the ground. So I'm going to write this down as the is as the object's telos. Telos, of course, for those who don't know, means the end in Greek. Meant in the sense of, like, the goal of the thing. So the telos of a seed is to be a flourishing tree and to produce other flourishing trees. So the end, by the way, can be an activity, which is, I don't know if that bears here, but it doesn't just have to be an object.
A seed can only be understood by its germination and its production of a new plant.
Right.
There is a process which needs to be understood, an activity, if you will,
Good.
that relates to the being in question. Without that activity, the being could not be what it is.
Right.
McIntyre actually says this far better when he says, such concepts are functional concepts. That is to say, we define both watch and farmer in terms of purpose or function, which a watch or a farmer are characteristically expected to serve. It follows that a concept of a watch cannot be defined independently of the concept of a good watch, nor the concept of a farmer independently of that of a good farmer, and that the criterion of some things being a watch and the criterion of some things being a good watch, and so also for a farmer and for all other functional concepts, are not independent of each other. So as you can see, there is now being a sliding scale added ontologically to the being. Some things being good or bad relates to what it is, because the identity of the object relates to a function or purpose. A good watch tells the time more accurately than a bad watch. A good seed propagates faster than a bad seed. These relate to functions and how well it is performed. So as you can see, the notion of being a good guitarist relates to one's ability to play a guitar, and this has moved good away from being a noun, and instead good is far more like an adverb. This is because good now relates to an activity or function. It relates to how well the function is actually occurring, how well the activity is being performed. It is no longer a description of the object. Of course, many of you philosophers who are watching this will see this as similar to Aristotle's notion of good.
Okay, so this is... no. Okay. This is really bad. I'm sorry, Lewis. Okay, so he's committing the fallacy of composition here, but in a subtle way. So the fallacy of composition says that what is what is true of the whole is true of the part, or is true of the part is true of the whole. I can't remember. I always mix up those two. It's a fallacy of composition and a fallacy of division, but they basically mean roughly the same thing, just in different directions. So a good watch, qua a good watch. Let's keep going. I want to see if he clarifies this.
Which there is a multiplicity of goods. However, have I not just split good into hypotheticals, into qualified goods? These are not goods in a categorical sense.
Okay.
So Aristotle may have said that the good knife is the one that cuts, although I doubt we'd feel that way if we were being stabbed. He may as well have also said the good gun is the one that shoots, although right now as we speak, there are hordes of angry Americans talking past each other about the Fifth Amendment.
Okay, so this doesn't actually matter. The question is, like, insofar as, like, a gun is good qua a good gun. Not, are guns good, simply, right?
No,
Right, and
they are
assembly
different
automatic
weapons,
hunting
John,
rifle.
and you're lying to
Oh, God, my
these
ears.
viewers and
I'm
trying
not
to
lying.
promote your
Tell me
agenda,
what the
and you're
difference
wrong.
is.
And
Tell-
I did not disturb
tell-
you, John.
tell-
Let me finish.
tell-
I did not disturb
you
you
just
while
called
you
me
were
a
lying to
liar.
these people.
This is
Look, whatever else is wrong with this video, let's just thank Lewis for not having a voice like that guy on the left.
because these are qualified goods, hypothetical norms if you will.
Okay?
These are built upon the premises that these functions are in fact taken to be good in the first place.
Right.
Just because something is good at doing something doesn't mean it is good in an unqualified sense.
Right.
So the question now exists, how do we go from hypothetical good to a categorical one? So here we come full circle to that Rand quote, good by what standard? However, I'm not arguing for a subjectivist, you can make up whatever standard you like and assert it to be the truth, like many philosophers give today, because we don't do that in philosophy. It isn't actually a good if we can't justify it. And so I'm going to relate this to something else,
I don't think
namely
that's true.
what you are and who you are. So what I'm going to argue for here is the functional concept of man. That man itself has a purpose or function built
Oh,
into it,
no.
and that this relates to their nature. Rand actually argues this best when she says, the capacity to experience pleasure or pain is innate to a man's body. It is part of his nature, part of the kind of entity he is. He has no choice about it, and he has no choice about the standard which determines what will make him experience the physical sensation of pleasure or pain. What is that standard? His life. We cannot actually assume what is good or bad for us in terms of what we will evaluate as being positive or negative phenomenological experiences. We cannot choose what will feel good and feel bad. These are determined for us by our organism, by our natures, by our psychological dispositions that we are raised in our socio-cultural spaces. We have been socially conditioned to associate good and bad with certain experiences, and these cannot
Okay.
be modified. It is far more like
Okay, I want to stop here for a second because he's sort of moved off what he implied before, that that good is an adverb. Okay, for good to be an adverb, it has to describe an activity. It doesn't describe an activity in this case. Good hasn't become an adverb. It remains an adjective. An activity that may also be described as quote-unquote good may be a condition of being a good watch. It may be an activity that a good watch must partake in to be a good watch. Or a good guitar player if you want to swap out telling time properly with playing the guitar well. A good activity that's essential to being identifiable as a good watch or a good guitar player. But this goodness of telling time in the case of the watch as a condition in no way changes the sense of quote-unquote good in a good watch. It doesn't change it to an adverb. A good watch, is not an activity, but an object. an object that performs an activity of telling time well, among other things. One doesn't ask, for example, whether one's watch is watching well, but you may ask if somebody's watch is working well, which is different. So a good watch, for example, can run out of batteries, right? It doesn't cease to be a good watch, it's just ceased to tell the time properly. So yeah, sort of implicit here is actually it's the fallacy of composition. So the idea that because we talk about good in the sense of the good activity that is a condition of being a good watch, in the sense of an adverb, that therefore the sense of good when referring, the sense of good that we mean when we refer to a good watch is also an adverb. No, it's an adjective. A good watch is an object, it's not an activity. These are different goods. And so, for example, we might also cite other factors that make a watch that tells time well not a good watch. A good watch could be too big. It could be ugly. It could have uncomfortable straps that you can't remove. The activity of telling the time is not exhaustive of the good watch's total goodness. And it's not even necessarily definitive of it by itself, even if it is a condition of it. Does that make sense? So, how about this? So he's going to go into talking about human beings in this way. So we could say, as an example, that a good human is invariably, in some respect, one that breathes well. But good human does not therefore mean breathes well, nor is good human an activity of breathing well. So, good has not become an adverb. That's just flat out wrong. I can't remember if this plays like a huge role going forward, but I hope it doesn't, because that's... it's not good.
An adverb. This is because good now relates to an activity or function. It relates to how well the function is actually occurring, how well the activity is being...
It relates to both. Let's move forward back to where we were.
Doing something doesn't mean it is good in an unqualified sense, and assert it to be the truth, like many philosophers give today, because we don't do that in philosophy. It isn't actually a good if we can't justify it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to relate this to something else, namely what you are and who you are. So what I'm going to argue for here is the functional concept of man, that man itself has a purpose or function built into it, and that this relates to their nature. Rand actually argues this best when she says, the capacity to experience pleasure or pain is innate to a man's body. It is part of his nature, part of the kind of entity he is. He has no choice about it, and he has no choice about the standard which determines what will make him experience the physical sensation of pleasure or pain. What is that standard? His life.
This is actually, factually incorrect. There is, for example, I forget the name of it, but there is a condition that one can have in which they are not able to feel pain because of a disorder of their nervous system. Let me actually look that up, actually. Condition of not being able to feel pain. Same with pleasure, incidentally. It's just called congenital insensitivity to pain. Oh, here we go. Sorry, congenital analgesia. Analgesia is one of or more rare conditions in which a person cannot feel and has never felt physical pain. Now we might not want to be super totalizing about that, because we can talk about emotional pain, things like that, but it's so creepy thinking about it. Oh god. This is why I hate philosophy. It makes you feel absolutely disgusting about your biology. Moving on.
We cannot actually assume what is good or bad for us in terms of what we will evaluate as being positive or negative.
Okay, so Jesus Christ says pretty sure doesn't mean physical pain. Okay, but we can talk about people who don't feel emotional pain either, right? Like, that's not a given. That every human being feels every kind of pain or any kind of pain. Or any kind of pleasure. There was a scandal a little while ago, in fact, because a woman in Belgium was euthanized because she was depressed. And according to the judgment of her doctor, which I think was exceptionally reckless, she would never be able to experience a positive... she would never have a positive life experience. She wouldn't be able to experience pleasure even from living. So that was used to justify killing a woman in her 20s, which was disgusting, by the way, in my opinion. I'm not like... I that is unambiguous to me, that one.
Phenomenological experiences. We cannot choose what will feel.
What about lobotomized lepers? If we're I wouldn't include lepers or people, like, again, he's talking... Rand in this case is talking about what's innate to human nature. So we can talk about, like, for example, a dead person doesn't falsify an account of what is innate to a living human being. Similarly, like an injured human being, so injured by a disease like leprosy, is not therefore a falsification of what is innate to a healthy human being. The fact that they lack things that are innate to healthy human beings is what makes it a disease. Similar with a case where you can't experience pain. Now, that one's a little bit trickier, because that's a faculty that's missing. So it's not clear to me that that constitutes a negative in terms of health simply. But the point is, like, we can imagine a situation in which somebody has to make moral decisions without having an experience of pleasure or pain.
Sensation of pleasure or pain. What is that standard? His life. We cannot actually assume what is good or bad for us in terms of what we will evaluate as being positive or negative phenomenological experiences. We cannot choose what will feel good and feel bad. These are determined for us by our organism, by our natures, by our psychological dispositions that we are raised in our socio-cultural spaces. We have been socially conditioned to associate good and bad with certain experiences, and these cannot be modified by just thinking them different.
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, they can be. Like, for example, you can think yourself into finding a food enjoyable or tolerable by rethinking what it is. So, for example, maybe you're somebody who has an extreme aversion to plants, or to eating plants on the grounds that, like, gross things like snails and slugs and whatnot crawl all over them and leave their residue and whatnot. So you never eat a salad. Well, you can think of it this way, like, well, that gross slime and whatnot is really just, like, when you boil it down, fundamental particles that I don't find gross by themselves, so I can thereby enjoy eating this salad. Like, you can think about things differently and change your preferences with respect to them, right? Or whether or not you feel pleasure or pain with respect to them. I feel like we kind of lost the plot here, though. How did we move to this? I'm sorry I have to rewind so much here, but it's just like...
Objectivist, you can make up whatever standard you like and assert it to be the truth, like many philosophers.
Okay.
Namely, what you are.
What you are.
And who you are.
Okay,
So
right.
what
So just for clarification, because we went off the rails a little bit there, what is he doing right now? He is trying to determine an objective morality, deriving it from a functional concept of a human being. So essentially, a teleological view of human beings that posits the end of the human being as the good. That's what I'm reading here. We'll see if he carries this out.
I'm going to argue for here is the functional concept of man. That man itself has a purpose or function built into it, and that this relates to their nature. Rand actually argues this best when she says, "The capacity to experience pleasure or pain is innate to a man's body. It is part of his nature, part of the kind of entity he is. He has no choice about it, and he has no choice about the standard which determines what will make him experience the physical sensation of pleasure or pain. What is that standard? His life." We cannot actually assume what is good or bad for us in terms of what we will evaluate as being positive or negative phenomenological experiences. We cannot choose what will feel good and feel bad. These are determined for us by our organism, by our natures, by our psychological dispositions that we are raised in our socio-cultural spaces. We have been socially conditioned to associate good and bad with certain experiences, and these cannot be modified by just thinking them different. So what Rand has done here is related good to our ability to desire. However, Rand would argue that to understand these desires as being an end in themselves would be a mistake. So we could imagine a scenario. A heroin addict who really loves shooting up heroin. It makes them feel great. Of course it does. It releases massive amounts of dopamine into their body. However, can we say this is good for him? No. Why not? Why would it be bad? The only reason that we can say that it would be bad is because we can distinguish between his preferences and his interests. A preference relates to a single moment of pleasure, a particular moment. This is a first order desire. A second order desire is something which relates to all other desires. It is us consciously taking the time to understand our desires themselves. When we understand that our desires themselves actually interact and that we have a psychological continuity of our existence, which culminates in our life, in a story, in an understanding, a way of being. And at the end of this narrative, they can either be more good ticks, or there can be bad crosses on each moment in which we experience. So what we seek is more good and bad. We seek as much good as possible throughout the greatest amount of time. This means that we must be rational about our decision-making processes. That hedonism will be self-defeating. That we could become heroin addicts, shoot up all the time, have a great 5 seconds, have a great 10 hours even, but then what have we got left to show for it? We may be riddled with diseases. We may get something like HIV and die prematurely. We may feel excruciating pain. We may feel homelessness and the pains of the outside world, of the weather.
Mom, give me some fucking money.
Okay, I'm gonna skip past this because I actually find this scene just psychologically offensive. But in any case, there seems to be something he's overlooking here, and that's that his. I mean, there's a whole host of other arguments with referring your human end to pleasure or pain simply, especially with referring morality to pleasure or pain. But in this particular case, with respect to hedonism, you could just not survive the high, right? Like, the stuff that he's brought up has to do with the fact that there is a length of time after you've shot up heroin. But what if there wasn't? Like, in aggregate? I don't know. Like, it... So, like, here's a way to think about it. Like, what if you didn't have a risk of disease, but as a result of shooting up heroin, you experienced all of your life's pleasure, which in aggregate is more than you would have experienced otherwise over the stretch of a normal, healthy life, but in a single moment with the rest of your life being not particularly painful, but not having any of those intensities of pleasure present. Like, maybe this thing you shoot up numbs you after the fact to that pleasure, right? Like, would that in some way be, or to pleasure generally, would that be preferable? Like, it so much here seems to hinge on the fact that you have to live with the consequences of it afterwards. But why is that necessarily the case? Which I'm not, by the way, I'm not suggesting anyone, like, should shoot up heroin and kill themselves. But, like, it's an important question, because if the argument you have is that you shouldn't shoot up heroin because you will have to live with the consequences afterwards, there's an easy solution to not living with the consequences afterwards, and that is don't. Right? Does that make sense? Like, there are cogent objections to this mode of critique. So I'm not saying, like, this is like an argument in favor of hedonism, because it's absolutely not, and I'm not a hedonist. But yeah, this doesn't... Yeah, and again, like, he's not a consequentialist, so I'm a little bit confused as to why this is even being brought up.
The outside world of the weather.
Mom, give me some fucking money, please.
No, don't give him money.
What are you?
Ugh.
So there is a numerous
I hate that clip so much.
amount of harms that can come forth from this one moment of pleasure. Is it worth the trade? So
Well, it might not be a trade.
disagreement with Rand, although you can't call it a massive one, is in relation to what the ego is and how we can act on behalf of the agent. So
Wait.
I would argue that the self is not as individualistic as Rand would like us to believe. The self instead relates to the concept of self-consciousness, an understanding of our experiences in which we can hold ourselves as an object, in which we can discern ourselves from the totality of our experiences.
Okay, we're going to take a 2-minute break, because I've been consuming vast amounts of liquids and I need to move for a second. But we'll come back. This is where it's finally going to get good, and I think we'll actually have some momentum here. We're at 21 minutes in. We only have 11 more to go, and he has to get us to objective morality, so... Stay tuned, I'll be back in, like, 3 or so minutes. Okay. We are back in business. Let's rewind a little bit.
Would like us to believe. The self instead agent.
Okay.
So I would argue that the self is not as individualistic as Rand would.
Okay, let's rewind a little bit more. I want to get this clearly.
Massive one is in relation to what the ego is and how we can act on behalf of the agent. So I would
Okay.
argue that the self is not as individualistic as Rand would like us to believe. The self instead relates to the concept of self-consciousness, an understanding of our experiences in which we can hold ourselves as an object, in which we can discern ourselves from the totality of our experiences. I'm making this point because human nature needn't function around the notion of life and preserving life at all costs. Instead, it could function around something else, and that is discernible from desire itself. A jump Rand has made is from desire to life, but the end of desire itself is the life of the agent, when instead it is the life that the agent wishes to live.
Oh, and by the way, if you want something a little bit hilariously ironic, given... I almost said Arendt. Given Ayn Rand's hatred of Kant, even going so far as to call him evil, I believe, in the virtue of selfishness. This is Kant's description of life. From the Introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals, which I guarantee you she hadn't read. She's dead now. The faculty of desire is the faculty to be by means of one's representations, the cause of the objects of these representations. The faculty of a being to act in accordance with its representations is called life. So, that's why I refer to Rand as a confused Kantian. Anyways.
the life in which the agent would experience the most value, not necessarily an abstract notion of life. To survive at all costs in utter agony goes against the notion of acting in one's own interests, if one's interests involve the notion of experiencing the greatest good and the least harm.
Exactly, so just don't survive the high. This is still a hedonistic ethics he's giving us.
We could see euthanasia as being a positive, but Rand could not.
Exactly. Exactly. Just don't survive your high, and there you go, you're good.
Therefore, is an investigation in the self. What the self is not something that we can assume. Self-consciousness is not actually inherent to our being. Self-consciousness is an emergent property developed through language. It's the ability to reflect upon our existence as an object.
No.
So what is the standard
Hang
if
on.
it is not in relation to life? The only argument that can be given is in relation to our experiences and ourselves as that experiencer. As an experiencer, we must evaluate ourselves. We must evaluate what is good for us as an agent. And we can only do that through applying linguistic concepts to investigate our being. This is to show that what humanity is far more than simply being a Homo sapien. It is not just the material, but it is the psychology. It is the ego. It is the development of mind. So Hegel argues for the development of self through what we call recognition.
Okay, so so this is going to get a little bit tricky, right? Notice the switch that has been made. So he said earlier that he's going to argue, he's going to argue for an objective morality, deriving it from the functional concept of a human being. He has now gone and introduced history into the mix, and this is critical because the fact that self-consciousness is not innate to humanity, the fact that it's something that is an emergence from historical interactions, that is, interactions through time between different agents, makes this whole thing not natural, right? Not in the sense that he was arguing. Like you could say that there's like some sort of implicit principle in beings being rational simply that causes that emergence in time, but I mean the problem with this is that this doesn't actually jive well with a teleological understanding of human beings in this Aristotelian sense, the sense that Lewis means it, that MacIntyre means it, that Aristotle means it, because these assume a consistent nature over time, a consistent composition, both psychologically and like in terms of your faculties, the kind of thing that you are. Like this is stable over time. Aristotle kind of lacks a concept of history that way. So we're no longer talking about, we're no longer like deriving an ought from an is statement like he said that he was going to do, that we were going to like bridge the divide. We are now introducing a set of historical contingencies. Such and such events took place such that self-consciousness emerged.
Recognition is where we understand ourselves reflected in the experience of another. We rely upon another individual to alienate, to negate our experiences. Because the totality of our experiences, everything that we feel and observe, is all that we can know and all that we can understand.
Hang on. Hang on a sec.
To go beyond that, we require something other. We require a mind that is separate from our own. This mind that is separate from our own allows us to negate our experiences. It allows us to think, maybe that is not the case. Maybe this table is not a table. Maybe this chair is actually not a chair. It allows us to create a negative to the positive of our experience. This negative allows us to discern objects from one another, forms of experience from one another, so I can now understand myself as being more than my experience of a given moment. I can understand myself as a psychological continuity.
Okay, this is a little bit reductive, but we're going to let him run with this. I don't think it's as simple as somebody else has an epistemically different experience from you. Or is that the word I want to use? I don't think you can reduce... This is basically the master-slave... Or this leads into the master-slave dialectic in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I don't think it can be reduced to a difference of perceptions, per se. It does involve a difference of perspectives, but this has to do as well with like things like contrary wills and whatnot. So it's not an epistemic question solely. But we're gonna let him run with this because I don't think that's actually so important in this case.
As an experience through time, in which I negate this single experience as only a part of the totality.
Right.
And not the entirety. I think Levinas refined this point further, and he makes this point even clearer than Hegel when he says, a meaningful world is a world in which there is the other, through whom the world of my enjoyment becomes a theme of having signification. Things that acquire a rational signification are not only one of simple usage, because the other is associated with my relations with them. In designating a thing, I designate it to the other. The act of designating modifies my relation of enjoyment and possession with things, places the things in a perspective of the other. Utilizing a sign is therefore not limited to substituting an indirect relation for the direct relation with the thing, but permits me to render the things offerable, detach them from my own usage, alienate them, rend them exterior.
Okay.
What Levinas is arguing we do with language is alienate the objects from our experience of them.
Okay.
We come to know them as they are through dismissing how they appear to us. We can reject the mere appearance of the thing and investigate the thing in itself.
Okay.
This is what we do with ourselves and our experiences. We reject the moment of pleasure. We reject a given desire, and we try to understand what is desirable in general. This means that what is meaningful to me and to you must exist in a common domain.
Okay, hang on. So...
In fact, Wittgenstein made a very similar point on his rejection of private languages, arguing that a notion which is absolutely private, that is constructed of a concept created by a single individual, would be meaningless, because we wouldn't be able to understand whether we are interpreting the concept as being itself or not. The rule would not be separate from our interpretation. This means it's, by definition, irrational, it's illogical, it's incoherent. And therefore, to speak of something that was absolutely private would be impossible. We cannot investigate it. Moreover, we cannot even understand it. This means that...
not from the perspective of a single subjectivity, though, and that doesn't mean it's actually not... That doesn't mean it's irrational, it just means it's not objective, right? But I'm a little bit confused here. So are we substituting... Are we substituting objective morality with meaningful? As in, like, if we can ascertain that there is a state of affairs that is meaningful, that therefore an objective morality applies? Because these don't mean the same thing. Like, for example, you can have meanings that are entirely amoral. About, like, say... The spatial division of the world is not necessarily a moral question. Taxonomies of organisms are not necessarily moral distinctions. I don't know. Like, I don't see. He's got like it's 26 minutes in, and he has about just under 6 minutes. A little over 5 minutes to get us to objective morality, and so far what he's got us at is private languages are meaningless. Oh boy.
That the ego and the investigation into ego is something that is actually common. It's something that exists between us.
Okay.
This means that the ego itself is not inherent within a being, but is instead the construction of a language game and applied to the agent.
No.
This language game, which holds us all within it, is what Hegel calls absolute spirit.
Okay.
This means that when we do
Okay,
ethics,
that's very wrong. So, again, spirit refers to self-consciousness. It doesn't refer to systems of meaning simply. This is why systems of meaning is not the condition of self-consciousness. So, for example, Hegel divides the world into different sort of cultural spheres that represent different levels of consciousness. So there's the Greek world, the Roman world, the the Oriental world or realm. It might be realm. I always forget that language. And the German realm, of course. These all have like internally consistent networks of meaning. Super complex and multifarious language games and framed within broader language games. So there's two problems here. First of all, spirit is not identifiable with a language game. A language game can be largely unself-aware. But secondly, he's making a false attribution. This is less important for our purposes here because this is more unique to like Hegel's ontology. But what he's referring to isn't absolute spirit, but objective spirit. So objective spirit is the self-consciousness of a community at the level of a state, which is to say it's self-consciousness between people. Sorry, not between people. It's emergent from relations between people that can then reflect on itself as a whole. Whereas absolute spirit is something like, this is a sort of loaded way of putting it, but it's almost like the consciousness of God as emergent from the increase, or not the increase, but as emergent from the collective self-consciousness of humanity or something, or of conscious beings in the world. That's a, I don't actually know if I want to frame it that way, but the point is what he's talking about is objective spirit, not absolute spirit. Absolute spirit is, of course, going to be concerning the absolute, right? So it's not going to be concerning a community of human beings. Because again, like none of this is absolute, because we can have the kind of thing that he's described as a language game incorrectly in multiple different spaces at the same time that are not connecting to each other, that aren't conscious of each other. So for example, when Kant talks about rational beings, we can have rational beings on Pluto who are unaware of rational beings on Earth, making the same kinds of universal determinations that can be applied to each other qua rational beings. Is that what I wanted to say? Did that make sense? I'm not sure. Anyways, you get the point. This is objective spirit, not absolute spirit. But that's trivial.
and we try to look for those principles which govern our behaviors, what we are doing is actually creating concepts to investigate what is a good life for the individual, for the particular.
Okay.
However, that particular agent cannot understand themselves individually. We understand ourselves collectively. We create categorical norms in order to achieve what we want to achieve. If we do create hypothetical norms, then we've asserted them. We have broke Hume's law. We instead must relate it to the functional concept of what we are and understand that we are acting within our own rational interests.
Why? How? How have we broken Hume's law? What? Sorry, we don't want to break Hume's law. We want to bridge the is-ought divide. But how have we done that? So if we do create hypothetical norms, we assert them, we have broken Hume's law. How do we break Hume's law by asserting hypothetical norms derived from... we are breaking Hume's law, but how do we, overcome it? No, we don't. And then he goes on, we instead must relate it to the function... We instead must relate what? Hang on, let me rewind this.
To achieve. If we do create hypothetical norms, then we've
Oh,
asserted...
hang on, that was important. Let's go back to 27 minutes. We'll just go from there.
This language game, which holds us all within it, is what Hegel calls absolute spirit. This means that when we do ethics and we try to look for those principles which govern our behaviors, what we are doing is actually creating concepts to investigate what is a good life for the individual or the particular.
Okay, so that's a weird sentence because he's talking about morality. He's talking about an objective morality, but he's, again, applying the language of ethics. Now, we do ethics partially by looking at what principles govern our behaviors, because ethics is it's a political project that's concerned with determining the best institutional ways in which to produce the best human beings. But
however, that particular agent cannot understand themselves individually. We understand ourselves collectively. We create categorical norms in order to achieve what we want to achieve. If we do...
Okay, so in order to achieve what we want to achieve... So again, like, this is the reason why Kant is so assiduous about making sure that we define the moral qua the moral without, like, an external factor creeping in. Because now we're talking about things that we want to achieve. Well, we're no longer talking about morality necessarily, are we? How do we distinguish between the stuff that we want and the stuff that we ought? Because the entire reason why we invoke an ought is specifically because we don't want the good all the time. So, or maybe we don't want the good ever. That's a possibility. And then...
do create hypothetical norms, then we've asserted them. We have broke Hume's law.
Yeah, no. No, you... I mean, yes, you have broken Hume's law. What Lewis means, though, is that we've overcome Hume's law. We've overcome the is-ought divide. We've derived an ought statement from an is statement, except that we haven't. We've just asserted an ought statement, deriving it from an is... Oh my god. Lewis, no. No. Oh no. Okay.
We instead must relate it to the functional concept of what we are, and understand...
I don't know what he's talking about. Relate what to the functional concept of what we are? The hypothetical? The good? Like, he's not clear here. I don't know what he's talking about anymore.
That we are acting within our own rational interests, that we must investigate together human nature and understanding. We must investigate sentience. We must investigate subjectivity itself, because the concept of subjectivity is that from which all ethics is derivative.
Okay. Like, is it? Like, when did we establish this? And how does this get us to an argument, much less a proof, that morality is objective? I've got so many questions here. Noah Watson asks, also, why is teleology being invoked, but in a way that disagrees with the person he's citing, as I don't think McIntyre was talking about pain and pleasure. This seems like it need to be... I don't think that's so important. I think the main issue here, though, is he's not, like, keeping his reasoning straight here. He's waffling between a teleological argument and something else. But, like, at this point, like, I don't even know what the argument is, because he seems to have just abandoned it. Now he's talking about subjectivity being the root of ethics. I mean, ethics concerns subjectivity, but ethics isn't derived from subjectivity. That's the whole reason why it's objective in Hegel.
This is why when Philoctetes spoke as being exiled from his Greek counterparts, said that he was a spectre, a ghost of himself, something that was only half man. He was incomplete without the other.
Okay, Philoctetes wasn't incomplete without the other, though. He wasn't without the other. He was without a situation in which he had rights and prestige in a community. He wrote that. Who did he write it to? Obviously there was another. He wasn't, like, shot out into space. He had to leave his homeland. Or his polis, or his city, or whatever. I don't know, Philoctetes. But, like... like... This doesn't make sense. Okay, let's just... We got 5 minutes left, or 4 minutes left. Let's just go through this.
This is because he was dependent upon a language in which he was alone to speak.
I don't know what he says here, in which he is alone to speak or allowed to speak. I mean, he's right, like in the sense that if we reinterpret Lewis as saying that Philoctetes was sort of broken by his exile because he was removed from a position in which he was allowed to speak as a citizen, but that's a political distinction. That's a loss of rank and a loss of privileges. That's not a loss of objectivity. That's not like a removal from having other consciousnesses, other conscious minds within your experience of the world. This is just a weird example.
He couldn't build new inferences and test them.
Yeah, yes, he could. He was just sent packing from his city. He could build new inferences and test them, just not with those people.
He was reliant upon the ones that had already been created. He was
What?
a history, something that had been and gone. This is why egoism is ultimately self-defeating.
What? He was a history, something that has been and gone. I mean, I guess he had been and he'd left. So he's something that has been and gone. I don't think that makes him a history. It makes him an object in history. Am I crazy here, or does this not make sense? Like, I'm actually having trouble following this at this point, and I don't think I'm stupid, so I'll entertain the possibility. But I'm just deeply confused.
When we seek a self-interested good as being inherently individualistic, we have defied the notion of self. The self is not individualistic. It's socio-historically created. It's embedded within our culture and in our language, and we must seek it together. In fact, the best way I've ever heard this described was told to me by a friend of mine. I am because we are. And on that note, we must seek what is good for us to seek what is good for the individual. The subject...
Okay. So... Hang on, let me just see if I get this right.
In fact, the best way I've ever heard this described was told...
No, not the Ubuntu thing.
Egoism is ultimately self-defeating. When we seek a self-interested good as being inherently individualistic, we have defied the notion of self. The self is not individualistic. It's socio-historically created. It's embedded within our culture and in our language, and we must seek it together. In fact, the best way
We must seek the self? Okay.
I've ever heard this described was told to me by a friend of mine. I am because we are. And on that note, we must seek what is good for us to seek what is good for the individual. The subject will find themselves in the objective.
What? How? Why? How does the subject now find himself in the objective?
And that objective ethics is how we will live the good life and reach what the Greeks understood to be eudaimonia.
Okay, so we weren't even talking about morality anymore. Like, this doesn't bear on decisions or behaviors. He's just giving a formalistic explanation at this point of what how Aristotle conceived of ethics, or of teleology, or of, I don't know, human flourishing. Okay, so what is he arguing for here exactly? So let's be super generous. As far as I can ascertain, what he's arguing for isn't objective morality in the sense of, well, I mean, what he's sort of implying by the title, morality is objective even if there is no God. He's arguing for a morality that is objectively interested, or he's arguing that morality isn't self-interested, or that morality has to be objectively interested to be self-interested. But where's the imperative? Like, what actually tells you that you have to do a thing, right? Like, when we talk about when people talk about objective morality, they want to know, like, is there a thing that I must do in all like circumstances simply because it's the good thing to do? Man, I'm so lost now.
Or human flourishing. Virtue and happiness are in fact the same thing. So here is a quick summary. The movement from morality to ethikos is a movement from a noun to an adverb, or an adjective to an adverb.
Okay, so no. Here, let's get that back on the screen. That doesn't even match what he said, but yeah. Yeah, no. So we've already seen that when we're talking about when we identify a good watch as being that watch which bears the quality of performing the activity of telling time in a good way. When we talk about the goodness of a watch as including as a condition that the watch performs an activity of telling time in a good way, or well, we don't thereby change the meaning of a good watch to be the goodness or the good performance of an activity. That is still a noun, referring to the quality of being a good watch, or referring to, like, sort of analytically, a good watch is that watch which has such and such conditions met as a watch. But it doesn't therefore mean the same. It doesn't therefore mean it's not therefore an adverb, because that thing is an object. It's not an activity. And you can illustrate this really clearly by just trying to reverse it. Well, is the fact that is the fact that we use the word good in the context of a good watch, when we say the sentence, "This is a good watch," does that therefore mean that we refer to the function, the proper function of that watch, as itself an object? I mean, we can, in terms of, like, bracketing the concept of function, but in terms of it actually performing that function well, do we call that an object? No. That's why, again, like, we don't say, "Hey, are you watching? Is your watch watching well?" Or does your telling time work? You see the problem?
Or an adjective to an adverb. This is to bring the function of the individual to the forefront so that the word good can be understood within reference to the object rather than as a characteristic or a trait of the object.
Wait.
The function of the individual can only be found in the function of the collective. The function is discovered through linguistically applying concepts to humanity itself. in which we seek to understand what humanity is and how it can live a good life, how we can live a good life. And what we seek to respect in that is our ability to feel pain and pleasure. This is because this is what is ethically considerable. Our ability to feel good and bad is what we are trying to maximize or minimize in the first place. And so what we seek is the maximization of positive and negative experiences throughout the collective of our lives, and so we create a language game and inferences to create principles which govern our behaviors and maximize the potential of living a good life. This forces us into a state of equal consideration. This allows us to falsify and verify our inferences together in order to mutually obtain eudaimonia, a state of virtue and happiness. And this is important because the end is more important than the beginning.
Okay. Okay. So let's go back a little bit. So, if you were paying attention, you'll have noticed something a little bit funny. Lewis has just betrayed his entire argument throughout this whole video. So let's start with the first part.
It is ethically considerable.
Here we go.
Feel pain and pleasure. In which we seek to understand what humanity is and how it can live a good life, how we can live a good life. And what we seek to respect in that is our ability to feel pain and pleasure. This is because this is what is ethically considerable.
Alright. So, as I indicated earlier, there are a host of well-known philosophical problems with treating pain and pleasure as encompassing that which is ethically considerable, quote-unquote. Not least of which being that pain is often instrumental in cultivating virtue. Recall that famous quote by John Stuart Mill that it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. But I don't even need to address these questions because Lewis not only just states this without argument, except for quoting Ayn Rand for some reason, it directly betrays the argument that he's been making up to this point. So, again, like leaving aside that literally all we have to suggest to us here that pleasure and pain encompass that which is ethically considerable is a quote from Ayn Rand, Lewis's whole treatment of ethics, of the human good, hinges on the argument that the human good is something communal. But pleasure and pain are private. They are entirely subjective. Do you see the problem? Okay, let's move on a little bit.
Our ability to feel good and bad is what we are trying to maximize or minimize in the first place. And so what we seek is the maximization of positive and negative experiences throughout the collective of our lives, and so we create a language game and inferences to create principles which govern our behaviors and maximize the potential of living a good life. This forces us into a state of equal consideration. This allows us to falsify and verify our inferences together in order to mutually obtain eudaimonia, a state of virtue and happiness. And this is important because the end is more important than the beginning. Okay,
so this is a little bit baffling. Okay, so this, first of all, this is wrong. This last bit on Aristotle. The end is not more important than the beginning in Aristotle. That is a massive mistake. The end is the beginning in Aristotle. The telos is the first cause. You can think of it as like the first mode of explanation. You understand a thing by reference at the beginning to the end. Sorry, you understand a thing in its beginning by reference to the end. And because you can do that, because that's how you identify the thing, the end is in the beginning. Hylomorphism, people. It's really cool. You should read Aristotle. But this is wrong. Is it super important? No, but it's wrong. But more importantly, this is the more baffling part. So, okay, so he tries to use a Wittgensteinian concept of a language game as equivalent to something that can ground an objective morality or an objective ethic. Here's the problem. What specifically distinguishes the Wittgensteinian concept of a language game from previous theories of language is that language games are non-representational. In a language game, meaning is derived from the rules. Think of moves in a game of chess. Moves make sense in chess only within the context of the rules of chess. I mean that chess moves only make sense within the context of the rules of chess. Removed from that context, like let's say we take a rook off the board and then try to move it, it has no meaning. This is not the foundation of an objective ethics or an objective morality. It's entirely subjective to the game, right? You can have multiples of these language games going on. You can have multiple objective spirits in the world. You can have multiple civilizations on different planets that are unaware of each other, and yet have achieved objective spirit, have achieved objective mind, self-awareness at the level of the state. It's, yeah, this is just, he has argued here to the extent that he has argued solely in favor of a subjective or a culturally relative morality. Certainly not an objective morality. You can't derive that from this. It's not, no, okay, here's something crucial though. Nothing he said here is incompatible with an objective morality. You just can't derive an objective morality from it. Okay. We're almost there. Let's finish this off.
And this is in the words of Aristotle, because it doesn't matter where we start, but if we seek to end in the same place, then we can work together to create principles of behavior which govern us towards a desired end. This is why we create certain institutions which then destroy themselves, or why we create certain institutions which become improved and become bettered by our critique.
This is so weird. Like, even as complete non sequiturs go, this is bizarre. The military hasn't destroyed itself. In fact, one of the major problems is that the military is one of the few things that seems to be thriving in many countries.
This is why Aristotle would have said that even though that we say that certain hypotheticals are good, like war, that we may end up dismissing those hypotheticals for another hypothetical, like medicine.
Wait, what?
Aristotle would have said that. This is why Aristotle would have said that even though that we say that certain hypotheticals are good, like war, that we may end up dismissing those hypotheticals for another hypothetical, like medicine.
I don't know what he means by this. Medicine and war are activities. I don't know why he thinks Aristotle would say this. I would like to know from where Lewis has gotten this impression.
Because they both end in the same place. That which we consider to be the good of us all.
What?
So, thank you all.
Wait, hang on. Did he just say that war gets... No, he didn't say that.
Create certain institutions which then destroy themselves, or why we create certain institutions which become improved and become bettered by our critique. This is why Aristotle would have said that even though that we say that certain hypotheticals are good, like war, that we may end up dismissing those hypotheticals for another hypothetical, like medicine, because they both end in the same place, that which we consider to be the good of us all.
He thinks that war and medicine end up in the same place, which is the good of us all? I mean, that's possibly compatible with Kant. I have no idea what the hell he's talking about, though.
So, thank you all for watching. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, and let me know, do you think ethics is objective? Let me know in the comment section below, and as always, try to gain some perspective.
Whew. Okay. Well, that was weird. I am so confused. What is his argument? Like it was sort of ambiguous until the very end, but then he locked it all down into this purely subjective thing. By subjective, I just mean, like, non-objective. Like, again, like, it's culturally relative. He does talk about networks of things in which sort of something lower than a categorical imperative can apply, or to which a categorical imperative can apply. So crucially, like, none of this is against the concept of objective morality. But man, I don't even know what the argument of this was. Like, it seemed like it was weird. So halfway through, he drops everything else that he was talking about and says, this doesn't count, I'm not arguing this, okay, fine. And then he argues for we can derive the good from functional concepts and overcome the is-ought divide, because he's a naturalist who disagrees with Moore that just because something is natural doesn't mean that you can't, sorry, just because something is natural doesn't mean that you can derive the good from it or an ought from it, right? And then he just kind of goes off the rails. So there's a lot to think about here. Like, this is interesting, but the problem is that, and I think maybe a lot of this is a function of where he was at the time, because again, like, this is incoherent to a level I've never seen him at, but he still recommends this video to people. So I am confused and baffled. Hopefully he'll come back so we can like get some questions. I don't know if I'll have him on just because I'm exhausted and I don't want to. I don't know. I don't like staking my position or what I end up saying on my ability to perform in the moment without like a ton of preparation, and I'm just not prepared to debate this. I'm not necessarily opposed to that in the future, like with time, but like there's a reason why I do a ton of research before putting my videos up. It's because like if I'm talking off the cuff, I will make huge gaffes. And to be fair to him, like maybe that's a major factor here. So he came on recently in the chat and he said that he does not read off a script. So if this is like a tired pre-PhD student just sort of doing this off the cuff and then adding in slides for a stream that he did, it's sort of understandable. What's a little bit baffling is that he's still recommending it to people, because this is one of the weirdest and most like disjointed and incoherent arguments I've ever seen, frankly. It's just weird. It has to fudge. I don't think he does this intentionally. Again, I think he's an earnest and sincere person. I don't think he was trying to put forward a bad argument as good, but for whatever reason, he couldn't identify the problems with this, or he sees something that I don't, some underlying thread that makes this make sense. But I don't see it. I have now watched this video through like 20 times, and every single time I go through, I find something new that's just baffling. It's so weird. But anyways, I feel bad. I don't want to hurt the guy's feelings while he's here. I didn't think he'd pay attention to it. But again, like, to be fair, like, his latest stuff is better. Much better than this, thank God. Except that he still shares this to people, so this is also his current stuff. So, alright, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for a Q&A. As always, I do ask, obviously, like, if somebody super chats for whatever reason, don't super chat, it's a waste of your money. But if somebody super chats for whatever reason, I will prioritize super chats. But otherwise, if you want to ask a question, I'm going to be scrolling through the chat on my phone. Leave an asterisk at the beginning and at the end. That's the star button. Leave a star at the beginning and at the end of your question so I can identify it while I'm scrolling through. Sound good? Alright, we're going to take 5 and then we'll come back for Q&A. Okay, so, yeah, so we're in question time now, so if you have any questions, asterisk, put an asterisk next to them so I can see them, and we'll try to go through those as efficiently as possible. I would like to get some food in my stomach. Because my actions are solely dictated by pain and pleasure, so... Okay. Yeah, so I'll come back in 2 minutes. I'm just gonna get some tea, and then we'll go. All right. So again, if you have questions or if you have things that you want me to talk about, put an asterisk next to your question. Okay? But let's... So Andy asks, what problem is solved by differentiating ethics from morality? I have found this is not something that is done in analytical meta-ethics, so maybe this is something crucial to Continentals. I'm not an analytic philosopher, so I couldn't necessarily speak to that. I would guess that the distinction is less important for analytics because they're not so much concerned with questions of history and culture in time, right? So they'd be concerned specifically with principles. So, again, like this would be the groundwork versus the metaphysics of morals. So, if you're just strictly talking about what is the good in terms of what directs action a priori, or what should direct action a priori, you don't really need to make that distinction that strong because, again, you're not like operating in time. Whereas with ethics, you're talking about the character of a person, of an organism. What kind of, what do they have, do they manifest certain virtues of character such that they are themselves inclined to do the good, what they ought to do. Like that would be one important use of that. You'll notice in Aristotle that he doesn't actually do, like if you read Aristotle's Ethics, he doesn't actually cover what a good action is per se. Rather, he distinguishes between virtuous activity and vicious activity. I might be BSing that a little bit, but it's something along those lines. That's sort of how I would understand ethics as opposed to morals, which now starts to concern people acting in their private capacity. So Kant, of course, is it in What is Enlightenment? He has an essay called What is Enlightenment, where he really centers the importance of private versus public conduct. Like this is all like part and parcel of the time period in which this is being written, in which you have like a greater degree of individuality emerging, in which now ethics starts to concern individual people who may be alienated from or may be considered to be ethically well, how do I want to say this? Who may be considered to have ethical weight to their actions despite being alienated from a broader society. So yeah. The utility of distinguishing between ethics and morality is that ethics concerns the qualities of a person that determine their moral action and determine their character. Whereas morality concerns primarily what actions are good. So this is why in Hegel morality is at the level of subjective consciousness, whereas ethics is at the level of objective. Because one is between agents, one is from a single subjectivity. I hope that makes sense. I'm super tired, so I'll probably have to wrap up soon. Thank God there are not so many questions, because I'm actually just exhausted, but I'll answer this last one. Noah Watson asks, what do you think the value of engagement in online politics is? It seems like philosophy is difficult enough. It is. But attaching it to group animosity and motivated reasoning would make it impossible. I think the value of engagement in online politics is largely that it allows you to demonstrate to people that there are other ways to think things and to accomplish their, I guess, to fulfill their needs than what some party or something is demonstrating. So, for example, like, you look at a right-wing channel, and they'll say something to the effect of, we're alienated from each other because of immigration. There's just so many different people with so many different ways of life that we've become uprooted and disaffected, and we're no longer invested in our communities as a whole. Well, one thing you can do is you can intervene there and say, well, actually, that's not the issue at all. In fact, people have perfectly productive and meaningful lives in community with people with vastly different backgrounds and ethnicities and histories and philosophies, things like that. The thing that you need to look at is, let's look at like what's actually changed in terms of the actual architecture of your community. So, for example, when you look at a city today compared to like a city like in ancient Athens, you don't see like a place with significant buildings that are designed around human activity. So you've got a market and a fortress at the center. You have an agora. You have walls protecting people. No, you just have roads and stop-bys on the way. And at no point is any of this place supposed to be important for the community. It's just kind of like you're a fish in a stream, and every landmark you pass by is just a fishing pole that's trying to catch you for a little bit. And that's one of the reasons why, that's one of the major structural reasons why we are, not structural, that's structural, that'd be structural. It's one of the major reasons, I'll say, for why we have a huge amount of difficulty in forming any kind of collective meaning, because populations are now not so much treated as communities of people who actually relate to each other in a concrete way. We're just sort of a standing reserve, as Heidegger put it, of material. We flow like through veins down roads and highways to places of work where we metabolize something, and then we leave and go back to these endless deserts of suburbs that are basically just warehouses for human beings. So that's one value, that's one major reason why I engage in online politics, is because I try to convince people that there are different ways of looking at things that are possibly more fruitful, that don't lead you into such dark and frankly vicious places. So, yeah. Yeah. So, are there any more questions? If there are not, I am happy to call it a night. I am extremely tired. So, I wonder if something's going on with the internet on my end, because it seems like chat is updating strangely. Like when I switch to live chat, I don't actually see... I guess it's been a while. I guess people are way far back. This was a really complicated stream. Well, in any case, I will be back next week on Sunday. Originally, I was going to review the Xander Hall and Lawrence Southern debate tonight, but I've decided that I'd rather have my friend Jalma with me, so hopefully, no guarantees, but hopefully they will be able to, he'll be able to join me for that, and he can probably address certain of the social issues that come up a lot more effectively than I can. But yeah, same time next week-ish. I will be late, as I usually am, unless I'm early. But I'm going to aim for 3:30 next week again. So, if you enjoy this stuff, or you enjoy my video essays, they take a lot of work. And I'm nowhere near at this point, at a point where it's self-sustaining, so I do also have to do actual work on the side. I would like to get to a point where I can do this as a job, but, you know. That said, if you like this stuff, your support is very much appreciated. I do have a Patreon that is much more worthwhile than sending super chats. I will try to answer as many questions as possible, especially given that YouTube takes a large portion of super chats, and I don't want you guys paying to ask me questions. I don't have enough of an audience for that to be an issue. Later on, this is perspective, if we ever grow larger than this and it becomes like necessary in order to distinguish between questions and just chats going on, then maybe. But either way, like, thank you very much for viewing. That's support enough. I do not require anyone to send money to this project. I do get enjoyment and meaning and personal growth out of it for its own sake. And thank you to Lewis for, I tore it to pieces, maybe unfairly. You can respond to it if you like. But thank you to Lewis for giving us some interesting food for thought at the very least. And again, like, I was pretty hard on Lewis in this. And largely, again, because this is a video that he offers to people right now as an argument for objective morals, and he disparages people pretty harshly on the grounds he thinks he has established in this video, which he may have established elsewhere more coherently, but he certainly hasn't here. But in any case, like, Lewis's stuff has gotten much better in the last year. So I don't think this is representative of his quality as a whole. And I will say this, like, he's made some horrendous mistakes, and it's an extremely misleading video, but it's mistaken in interesting ways, and sometimes that's enough. So anyways, without further ado, we're done. That's a wrap. Thanks everybody for watching. Have a good evening and take care.